All right, so we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the
Again.
time to come and listen to the presentations today. My name's Hannah James, and I've been working as the Youth Participatory Action Research Intern with the Center for Innovation this past summer, and I will be your moderator for today. The theme of today's presentation is Equitable Practices, and we'll be hearing from three of our amazing student researchers today. I'd also like to remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And if there's time, we'll also have an additional time for questions at the end of the panel. The chat and the Q&A options will be open throughout the presentation and will be monitored. So please feel free to engage with that during the presentation, and all of your comments and questions are really appreciated, and we will do our best to get to all the questions. But I do apologize if we do not get yours to yours today. So before we get started with today's presentations, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the town of Quispamsis, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The name Quispamsis draws its origins from the Maliseet word Quispamsis, which means little lake, referring to what is now called Ritchie Lake, located in the town center. I invite you to share and reflect on the land from where you are joining today, and we'll get started. So our first presenter of the day is Megan Ketley, who will be presenting her work titled Pre-Service Teachers' Views on the Emergency Remote Education in Low-Income Rural Nova Scotia, a review on literature on digital equity as illuminated by COVID-19. Megan Ketley is a Year 2 student in the BEd program specializing in secondary education. She returned to her rural community for a practicum where she witnessed the consequences that resulted from emergency remote education. This experience, in addition to her active participation in education research, has prepared her to investigate this phenomenon. The floor is yours, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining me today. While I just get my screen up and ready to share, perfect. I'm going to look to Hannah to give me a confirmation that the presentation's up. Hannah, can you see the presentation?
Yep, you're good, Megan.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. All right, awesome. Thank you, everyone, again for joining me today. My name is Megan Ketley. My pronouns are she, her, and this past summer I've had the privilege of investigating the impact of emergency remote education in rural Nova Scotia. A little bit about myself. I graduated from Dalhousie in 2020 with a Bachelor of Arts in English, Theater Studies, and Sociology and Social Anthropology. But now I am studying in the Bachelor of Education program here at St. FX, where I'm going into my second and last year of the secondary stream. Over the past year, I've had the fantastic experience of working as a research assistant for Drs. Dan Robinson, Jennifer Mitten, and Greg Hadley, as well as being a Center of Employment Innovation research mentorship. So yeah, I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of what my presentation will look like today. For the sake of time, I'm going to give a very brief background of understanding what rural poverty and education looks like in Nova Scotia, as well as a quick review of some of the findings from the literature that I have been reviewing over the last few months, talk about some implications for future practice and research, as well as what the next steps of my project entails, conclude with a few comments, and then I will open the floor for questions if anyone has any. So to begin, before I go into the background, I wanted to just share a little personal anecdote about why this project means so much to me. So I grew up in Guysborough County, Nova Scotia, which is a very rural community. And so I returned there for my practicum this past year and saw a lot of the consequences of at-home learning from both teachers and students alike. And it really was disheartening to hear some of the lack of support and feelings of uncertainty that a lot of students felt, and it seemed unique to the rural experience. So that sort of is what has inspired me to look into this phenomena And I'm excited to share with you some of the findings and sort of the where we go from here. But before we can even begin to understand the extent to how COVID-19 has really impacted the economy in Nova Scotia, it's important to begin looking at where poverty stood pre-pandemic. And we can find this out by looking at the 2020 report card on child and family poverty in Nova Scotia, which was created using 2018 census data. And it tells us that 1 in 4 children in Nova Scotia are living in poverty. Nova Scotia also has the highest rate of poverty in Canada and has performed noticeably worse than all other provinces and territories in combating child and family poverty since 1989, when the House of Commons put in place the act to fight family and child poverty. And though the economic consequences of the pandemic are still unraveling, we know that pre-pandemic, these numbers were increasingly climbing. So not only do we know that 1 in 4 children in Nova Scotia today live in poverty, that number is expected to increase severely over the next few years. So how can we understand how the pandemic has either inflicted or exacerbated the poverty rates in Nova Scotia? Well, we can look at how suspending public gatherings and preventing places of work to be open, how that put detrimental shocks to the economy. But this also put more children and youth at risk of poverty for a variety of reasons. Some of the more common reasons are due to the lack of parents having to go to work. So parents of young children had to stay home regardless of whether they could afford to or not. And in rural communities especially, a lot of work placements there do not support work from home strategies. And so parents had to take leaves of absence to stay home when schools and childcare centers closed. On that same note, there was a loss of precarious employment opportunities. Precarious employment opportunities can sort of be defined as any employment that really is part-time, seasonal, temporary, really just doesn't support any kind of benefits or a livable wage. This is also referred to as the gig economy. And a lot of people in rural communities rely on this type of employment for income into the family. And so because a lot of these employments as well require working in the public sphere, precarious employment had to come to a halt. And then again, in Nova Scotia, anyone who relies solely on government support for income, such as at the time of the pandemic, the CERB benefits or employment assistance, 100% of those people live in deep poverty because the income that they receive from the government is 75% lower than what we measure for the poverty line. So because of the loss of income, because of the loss of job opportunities, the number of people living in poverty in Nova Scotia is only expected to have increased. But what does this mean in terms of rural poverty? Unfortunately, rural poverty is marginally unexamined in Canada, despite that 18.5% of Canada's population lives in rural communities. Most of our existing data on rural poverty, on poverty in general, looks at urbanized populations, which in my opinion disregards the circumstances of rural poverty that are unique to many different concerns. In Nova Scotia, child poverty is the highest in Cape Breton, which is a marginally rural community, and 45% of Nova Scotians live in rural communities. We can define rural poverty by considering the geographical isolation from public infrastructure such as libraries, shopping centers, public transport, etc., that all aid in people in poverty by providing them with access to internet, technology, and opportunities for income and socialization. The number of people living in rural communities is increasing and has been increasing over the last 60 years. And although the number of people in urban poverty to total poverty is extremely greater than rural poverty, it's still a concern that we need to consider when talking about rural education, especially here in Nova Scotia. So what does this all mean for rural education in Nova Scotia? Well, as I mentioned, the impact of COVID-19 is still quite unraveling, and we don't quite know to what extent many of our concerns will be observed. However, there are a few things that we do know that we can kind of pick apart to assume what the impact will look like. One of those things being that during the time of emergency remote education, 72,000 homes in Nova Scotia could not access high-speed internet, which is something that is required in order to adequately complete one's education. And then again, we can return to the number of Nova Scotia children who were living in poverty at the time, and thus predictably could not afford proper educational tools, such as internet, technology, etc. So a term that I'm using quite frequently is the idea of emergency remote education. So before I go into sort of the themes that I'm looking at in the literature, I wanted to take a moment to define what I'm talking about when I talk about emergency remote education. And that would be the fact that the emergency remote education is different from that of when we speak of online learning or at-home learning, because the emergency emphasizes the severity of the conditions that students were living under. One study that I took this term from and used a lot in my literature review is their definition describes it as a distinction that emphasizes the unplanned nature of teaching, as well as lack of adequate preparation and support that generally characterizes online learning. So the use of emergency is more accurate and probably more appropriate use than when we talk about at-home or online learning. So though you may hear those terms interchangeably, I just wanted to draw your attention and have you point that out in the back of your head. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of the themes that I noticed, but two of the prominent themes that I have discovered were pre-service teachers' understanding of rural poverty, as well as what the post-pandemic teacher education and professional development will look like. I'll also touch on how pre-service teachers' understanding of rural poverty intersects with students' racialized backgrounds and as well as students' home environments. So when we describe teacher identity, we mostly are talking about how teaching comes from practicing in and from our classroom communities. So, pardon me, I'm just looking at my notes here. So there's a small cluster of research on the formation of teacher identities in rural contexts, but largely most of our teacher education programs across Canada do not support rural pedagogy or rural specific strategies in their programs. What this means for teacher education is that when pre-service teachers are placed in rural settings for practicum or first year teaching, they often report negative experiences such as isolation from professional opportunities, isolation from community members, and understanding of community members, etc. However, there are some supportive findings for the implementation of rural specific strategies in teacher education, but what this means for post-pandemic education is largely unobserved, as well as the research that does exist is very minimal. There's only a handful of studies that looks into pre-service teachers' understanding of rural poverty. However, one notable study that expresses how important rural specific strategies are looks at putting student teachers into a rural community in Newfoundland where they lived and taught for the duration of their practicum. And the majority of students there reported positive experiences, and a lot of them actually ended up staying and teaching there following graduation from teacher education program. Again, though, this is an increasing concern for education as we explore what rural has done to poverty and as it increases with the pandemic's economic collapse. So I want to also touch on how this intersects with students' racialized identities. So of course, pre-service teachers' understanding of rural poverty is important when we consider this because BIPOC identities make up the vast majority of poverty rates in North America. In the face of the pandemic, Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic people were twice as likely to be impacted by pandemic-inflicted poverty and health-related issues. And additional influences of rural poverty, such as food insufficiency, lack of adequate internet, etc., all are compound factors that contribute to the disparities in education that racialized learners in rural settings experience. Some studies pointed to search intensity data, which demonstrated how often different communities and areas of populations were searching for online reading material and online learning material. And in Black rural communities, those numbers were twice as down than what were in even white rural communities. So that suggests that there's a disparity in education between those students. Additionally, Indigenous reserves have very little internet access and also very low technological skills due to like systemic barriers that prevent them from accessing such information. In terms of intersections with students' home environments, children in low-income households are less likely to have the resources to complete education during the height of the pandemic. And although many governments, such as our own government here in Nova Scotia, did not penalize students academically for their inability to complete their education, students were still isolated socially and academically when not having the tools to complete online learning. Many studies also reported that teachers required students to leave their cameras on during at-home learning, which caused severe problems for social emotional consequences because students were sharing their personal lives on screen for all of their students to see, often sharing what the extent of home life was like, especially if it was not safe or if they were living in an unquote unfavorable environment. Many of these led to different types of consequences, more than just what we observed academically. So that all being said, what is this going to mean for post-pandemic teacher education and professional development? So pre-service teachers are in a unique position because they're entering the field in a post-pandemic world, whereas in-service teachers know what it's like before the pandemic and are experiencing the consequences afterwards. Pre-service teachers are going in fresh, and so it's important that all of these pre-existing recommendations to teacher education programs about implementing rural strategies, rural pedagogy, are more important now than ever. So scholars are calling for the inclusion of rural pedagogy and professional development into teacher and education programs, pointing for the need for more professional development on literacy, digital literacy, especially for students who are, quote, at risk. This is becoming increasingly more important as we navigate and discover what the economic consequences of COVID-19 are. To quote this one research, new teachers must be prepared in their teacher education programs to serve the rapidly growing number of online students and have the pedagogy skills for the blended learning models of the future. However, this review does caution that online learning cannot be seen as a sole remedy to the equity concerns in accessing education. Some studies do point that online learning does support students in poverty because of the flexible schedules, allows them to work and complete homework when they can. However, it's still not an equitable resource, which in my review I talk more into depth about, but I'll leave that for now today. If you have questions about it, I'll happy to answer. Okay, so some of the implications for practice. So for students in rural low-income communities, the experience of emergency remote education was entirely unsuccessful and at times unethical. The pandemic has illuminated various avenues for concerns for future practice. Some of those include the improvements to welfare systems and rural infrastructure, building of enduring professional communities online or in person for rural educators, improvements to teacher education and professional development in the pedagogy of care to prevent social-emotional risks for at-risk students, etc. What we mean for implications of research, there are two avenues that I'm going to discuss, one of those being rural pedagogy and teacher education programs. So as I've mentioned before, there are some strong studies suggesting that implementing rural pedagogy and rural strategies into teacher education programs can really benefit the teacher turnover in such communities, as well as the formation of their teacher identities. However, our most recent study on this is of 2011. So we are due for a real upgrade into what this means and what this could look like. Additionally, the pandemic, by illuminating a lot of the discrepancies and inconsistencies in our education system, we are more in need of this now than ever to incorporate these things. So I believe that further investigation of these topics is a must. Additionally, I think that pandemic-informed teacher education should be another stream for future research. So current research on post-pandemic for teacher development focuses more so on in-service teachers. And although, of course, they are important to navigating post-pandemic, I think it is still really important that we look at what our pre-service teachers are learning and then bringing that into their future classrooms. So the next steps of my project, part of my summer work, I conducted a survey with pre-service teachers at the DED program here in Antigonish. And my next steps are to sort of analyze the data and see sort of what they saw in their schools. So the survey asked for them to describe what they learned in their practicum, what they saw in terms of, who had internet and who didn't, who seemed to be falling behind, and also space to share any additional comments or concerns. So the next steps for me are to analyze that and sort of look for threads of trending themes and such like that, and then share those findings again in a similar presentation as this with my fellow students to sort of kind of go from there and learn from that. So to conclude, I just wanted to reiterate the importance of research such as this. So the pandemic is still so new and so fresh, and our consequences are still unraveling. We do not really know what is going to happen in education in future years. So studying the trends of things that happen to us during online learning are really important. fundamentally, rural school systems, including pre and in-service teachers, administration, stakeholders in teacher education, and educational policymakers need to understand the severity of learning from home and living at home during the pandemic for people in rural and low-income settings. The review here attempts to draw attention to these experiences, in addition to supporting the development of future teacher education programs and the integrity of pandemic-informed rural pedagogy. Wanted to thank you all for coming to my presentation today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. I wanted to give a brief thank you to Dr. Jennifer Mitten for all of your support during this past few months, as well as to CEI for granting me this opportunity. So thank you everyone so much.
All right, thank you, Megan, for your amazing presentation. It was really interesting to see a little bit more about your work and how the pandemic has impacted the learning of rural students. So we're now going to move into a Q&A session. So the first question is, based on the survey with students, what do you anticipate that you will learn and how might this align with the findings of the literature review discussed in the presentation?
Okay, thanks, Jennifer, for your question. I had a feeling you'd ask me something. Yeah, so sort of what I anticipate to see in my survey are the students who taught in rural communities, such as myself and being here in the rural town. I believe it'll align with a lot of what is being saw there. A lot of students may have felt unprepared to teach in those communities, unprepared for the type of students they were teaching to, the conditions their schools had, the supplies, and the material they were available to them. I think will be largely consistent with the concerns that pre-service teachers had 10 years ago in those same surveys. And I'm interested to see as well how that changed in light of the pandemic.
Just looking here. So another question is, wondering if you are aware that some Indigenous communities here receive free Wi-Fi.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, many Indigenous communities are working towards receiving free Wi-Fi across Canada on reserve sites. However, the adequacy of the internet is completely unreliable. It's not necessarily high-speed internet. It's more of just access to being able to log on to the internet and use it, but it's very unreliable, not very strong, not something that could really support Zoom or Google Hangout or any of the types of educational technology that students were using, unfortunately. In Nova Scotia, I do know that there is a project looking to support implementing high-speed internet into rural communities across the board. However, as I mentioned in my presentation, the progress on that is quite slow, and it doesn't really specify what that means for Indigenous and Black communities, especially. Thank you for that comment, though. I appreciate that.
All right. Andrew's also wondering if your whole presentation is available to use as a reference.
I can make it available. I can put my email in the chat once I'm finished with the Q&A, and if you're interested, I can share it with you. I will just caution that I still am working on the survey results, but if you'd like to have a look at the presentation, I would be more than honored to share that with you.
I'll also just let you know, Megan, that you're getting wonderful comments, and yeah, and Kerrigan just said that she's looking at a project very similar about how there's a barrier with technological literacy as well. And Marion was wondering, does your survey ask about the types of online pedagogy or training on platforms when teachers had to pivot online?
That's an interesting question, Marian. I didn't include that necessarily in my survey because based on the research I had done before administering the survey, just trying to word this correctly, the pivot to emergency remote education was so swift and quick that there really was no training for teachers, for pre-service teachers and like teacher education programs. It was so fast and so swift that teachers were kind of just thrown into the pit and expected to sort of figure it out. I only know that personally from speaking with teachers during my practicum who had that experience. I did consider putting that into the survey, but whereas many of the pre-service teachers who taught during emergency remote education, they were just like practicum was over. They said, you know, okay, finish practicum and that's it. They didn't go back to school. They didn't go back to online and helping. So really my survey is kind of looking at what pre-service teachers are witnessing in the aftermath. So going back to in-person learning, returning to face-to-face learning, and sort of the discrepancies they noticed in that return. So not necessarily what exactly happened during at-home learning, but like where do we go from here and how do we learn from when students returned? I hope that makes more sense about the survey.
All right, awesome. So I would just like to remind everyone that we will have some additional time for questions, perhaps at the end of the panel, but we will move into our next presenter. Thank you again, Megan. Your presentation was really informative. So now we're going to move into our next presenter's presentation, which is Mia Landy, who will be presenting Don't Diss the Ability, a look into diversifying higher practices. Mia Landy is entering her 4th year of studying sociology, and her research interests include social inequalities and youth with exceptionalities. This is Mia's first summer as an intern with the CEI, and she has been able to develop a deeper understanding of the barriers facing youth with autism spectrum disorder. The floor is yours, Mia.
Thank you, Hannah, for that warm welcome. And Megan, amazing job. Thank you for sharing your work with us today. I'm just going to pull up my presentation now. And Hannah, would you be able to let me know if you all can see that, please? Is it visible on your guys' end?
Not yet, Mia.
Okay, let me try. I'll stop sharing and I'll try that again. Is that working now?
No, not yet.
I think it's visible on my, sorry, this is Megan. It's visible on my end and I'm looking at the chat and I think some people can see it.
Okay, yeah, I can see it now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so once again, I'd like to thank you, Hannah, for your warm welcome. As well, I wanted to share my appreciation to the CEI for providing this platform for myself and other student researchers to share their field of interest and important work. I thought I would just do a quick introduction. Yes, my name is Mia Landy. My preferred pronouns are she, her. This has been my first summer with the CEI as the Youth Accessibility Research Intern. And this coming fall, I will be entering my 4th year studying sociology at St. FX. And I have a passion for developing a deeper understanding of social inequalities. However, these more specifically looking into barriers towards individuals with exceptionalities and disabilities. Before moving on, I would like to begin by acknowledging the language that I'm personally going to use throughout this presentation. So currently, there is no clear consensus in the literature regarding the most preferred language from autistic people. There is, however, a consensus on the least preferred and most offensive language, this being the person-first approach, for example, person with autism. It is because of this, as well as further research, that I personally will be using an identity-first language, autistic person, throughout my presentation. This decision to choose this language came from listening and reading to stories from autistic people, the literature with this community, as well as the overall choice to hold myself accountable to appropriate language. I would also like to acknowledge how the best way to use appropriate language comes from solely asking individuals which they prefer, but as I did not have the opportunity to do so in my presentation, I will continue with IFL. I also would like to acknowledge that this is a continuous learning journey for me myself, and that I may not be using the correct terminology at all times. Today, I will be covering the bigger picture of autism spectrum disorder and unemployment. And within this topic, I will discuss what ASD is and unemployment, rubric development, my rubric, and a takeaway message. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurological condition and developmental disorder that includes impairments in language, communication, and social skills. Although ASD is considered a spectrum disorder, as there are a range of impacts that individuals experience and that no two individuals are the same, the disorder can be characterized by core features. Autistic people have difficulty with communication and interaction with other people, restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, and challenges one's ability to function in school, work, and other areas of life. As mentioned, ASD is referred to as a spectrum disorder as the range of abilities and limitations is very different depending on the individual. While each autistic person will manifest their condition uniquely, generally, autism is characterized as disrupted social skills, communications, and sensory systems, as well as repetitive behaviors. I wanted to quickly begin with sharing a stat in the left top-hand corner that was the first realization that I had towards understanding the relationship of ASD and unemployment. And it reads, autism has the highest unemployment rate than any other disability with a 14.3% employment rate. I'm just going to let that sit with you because that translates to an 85.7% unemployment rate. Within the literature, it has been made clear that individuals of neurodiverse backgrounds face several barriers within the application and hiring process too. Next, I wanted to share with you a stat that hits close to home for me personally as I'm joining you from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is that in 2016, Nova Scotia had the highest disability rate in Canada. As well, in 2017, there were 6.2 million Canadians aged 15 and older with a disability. And in Canada, roughly 1 in 86 children are diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder. During each stage of employment, autistic people will face barriers. Beginning with the early stages within recruitment, individuals will face a number of barriers, some including retrieval of information and job postings. Often, most job postings are listed online and electronically. Although this can be a very convenient form for some, it does serve as a barrier for individuals as most sites may not be user-friendly for neurodiversity. Next, the traditional interview process is problematic for individuals who are neurodiverse. It challenges their communication and social skills and does not represent their ability to succeed in the workplace. Next, for onboarding and retention, a common finding has been that a huge barrier, if not the biggest, is challenges within the environmental and social routine as it kind of disrupts what some individuals may be used to. And as well, I want to draw your attention to the statistic that was pulled from Ready, Willing, and Able, which is an amazing organization that provides resources and courses to help support inclusive hiring. And they found that 57% of job accommodations cost nothing, and 37% of those would have a one-time cost of $500 or less. After sharing that reality of ASD and employment with you, I do want to share how there are many companies that too have recognized this issue and have established programs to help support inclusive and diverse hiring. Through examining their practices and identifying barriers, we can help tackle this issue of inaccessible hiring for autistic people. This summer, I developed a rubric that could be used to grade the degree of accessibility for companies in Nova Scotia regarding their application process for neurodiverse individuals. I began the early stages of this development through analyzing with career experts from Autism Nova Scotia and Ready, Willing, and Able the gap and disconnect in the early employment stages, specifically involving the application process. Through conversations, it was revealed to me of the barriers and inaccessibility facing this community when applying due to the structure of the application process. Following this realization, I began the early stages of development. The rubric development began following the completion of a literature search, which specifically identified the barriers facing autistic people within the application process. From feedback from community experts, I was told of the disconnect within the application process specifically, and the numerous barriers that autistic people face when seeking the job posting and applying for the position. Following this, I immediately dove into the literature and was able to identify 6 key factors that inhibit accessible practices. These including a lack of forms of submission options, job requirement terminology, inaccessible application formats, accommodations, a company value statement and language, and lastly, the steps within the application. Following the narrowing of categories, I began my first draft of the rubric. So for the analytic rubric development, I followed the structure, which began with determining the skills and abilities companies should demonstrate to show achievement of inclusive hiring. This for me looked like completing an environmental scan and literature search. Through the environmental scan and the completion of the lit search, as well as engaging with community stakeholders, I was able to determine the categories and barriers in the application process. The next step included determining the levels of achievement possible given the expectation of what companies should demonstrate. Here I determined what the expectation should be for inclusive applications. And finally, I had to create descriptions for the criteria along each level of achievement. The reasoning as to why I believed a rubric would be a great output was that rubrics provide clarity for assessments, they simply identify a clear answer key, and they directly communicate the required area of improvement. I would also like to state now how my rubric is still requiring continuous feedback and changes. Rubrics are never done, and this is my work in progress. Descriptions will refine and improve and be more precise with time. Initially, I had hoped at this time to apply it to companies in our province. However, moving forward, my next step is to bring it to experts and the community, receive feedback, and continuously evolve and improve this project. This is not the final draft and is far from perfect. So as you guys can see on the screen, I will now be sharing the categories and description of my rubric. For this rubric, I used an analytic rubric with the scales of 0 to 1, 2 to 3, and 4 to 5. The reasoning as to why I used this criterion was so I could continuously refine each category and give meaningful feedback for different companies. Beginning with the first category was submission options. So the traditional application process involves many barriers for autistic people. When companies are advertising and recruiting, it is important to recognize how the application process, which was designed for and by neurotypical individuals, can serve as a barrier as well as steer individuals away from applying. The unfortunate reality is that if the application process doesn't evolve, unemployment rates amongst individuals from this community will continue to increase. As of 2019, 14.3% of Canadian adults aged 18 to 64 living with ASD were employed. This statistic, as well as the literature that shares how adjustments need to be made to the hiring process, reveals the importance of evolving the application process and providing autistic individuals with options that address their needs. With an increasing dependency on technology and online tools in recruitment, employers today commonly place job ads and applications online. This advertisement delivery can often not be received by autistic individuals, as many sites can serve as barriers due to the inaccessibility of their platform. Therefore, if employers want to create diverse and inclusive workplaces, they must incorporate alternatives across each stage of hiring and employment. Ultimately, companies should allow for various forms of resume submission. These could include email, video options, website, or in person to help alleviate potential barriers for autistic people. Through allowing for alternative options, companies will be contributing to a more accessible and inclusive workplace that ensures that everyone has an equal opportunity to apply. My next category is job requirement terminology. Looking at characteristics of ASD and the impacts that individuals experience, which is taking things literally, it is important to recognize the wording and terminology of job requirements. When posting positions, employers should make their posting as simple, straightforward, clear, and concise in layman's terms as much as possible. As well, it is critical that employers focus on essential skills that are required for that specific job position. On this page here, I've included a screenshot from a job posting in Nova Scotia that is for a night shift of stocking shelves. Included in the description of the job is that you will be working during the night and closed hours. However, similarly posted in the job description is that the requirement that you have to approach customers, work a till, and have good communication skills. These are not required for this specific position, as you would be working during non-operating store hours. This demonstrates the inaccessibility of a job posting and how important it is to concentrate on required skills for that specific job position. My next category is job posting alternative formats. When posting job advertisements for potential candidates, it is important that companies recognize differences within their hiring pool. As well, companies and employers should be mindful of not only neurotypical individuals, but as well as people from diverse groups. Through recognizing a diverse pool and realizing the barriers some people face when using electronic application processing systems, companies can better understand their application pool. Another format that can support accessible and inclusive job hiring could be to ensure that companies' job postings are accessible for people who use computers differently. Ensuring that companies' job postings are inclusive by being distributed in various formats allows positions to reach many candidates, including those in the untapped pool of skilled workers. If it's possible for companies to advertise job postings on multiple platforms, which ultimately leads to alternative formats, they have the possibility of reducing application barriers for communities. It is important to recognize that online and electronic job postings and applications could serve as a barrier for some people. The next category I have is accommodations. When applying for jobs, autistic people experience the uncertainty of whether they can request an accommodation. For this barrier to easily be dismissed, employers can include a statement that encourages candidates to feel more comfortable to make a request. Included below is a draft of a short statement that could be included in a job description. As you can see in this slide, it is a form of an accessibility request which is used throughout Microsoft. By providing candidates with the opportunity to share their experiences and requests, companies are creating an environment where individuals from neurodiverse backgrounds can freely apply to job positions with one less barrier. This simple and easy accommodation allows for companies to be viewed as more accessible, accepting, and welcoming to a unique hiring pool. Next, I have company value statement and language. Including a company value statement can encourage diverse applicants by demonstrating inclusive values, interests, and guiding principles at their workplace. Language plays a powerful role in contributing or eliminating discrimination. For individuals to feel inclined to apply, it is critical that employers and companies provide the impression that they have a healthy environment to attract applicants. For example, when companies send out a job posting that includes inclusive language, they show a level of awareness and inclusivity. As well, in the 21st century, we are being held now more than ever for our actions, words, and manners towards underrepresented and minority groups. Specifically with language, it is important that companies and employers are aware of appropriate language. When changing a phrase, it alters the subtle connotations and nuances of the speech and communicates a different meaning and context than the original phrasing. My final categories is steps. When creating job applications, it would be beneficial for employers and companies to consider the layout and format of the application. Commonly, autistic people are highly dependent on a set routine, clear and detailed plan of what to expect, and often experience stress because of changes in their routine. While in the workplace, companies' mission should be to prioritize supporting employees as this is important to overall success. For companies to support and help their employees who deal with changes in the workplace, it is vital to inform changes ahead of time, outline a schedule of expectations, and ultimately provide employees with as much advance notice as possible. Just as employers should accommodate throughout employee retention, it is critical that companies are aware of support they can provide throughout the application process. Often autistic individuals experience difficulties with changes in routines, surprises, and ultimately an unawareness as to what can happen next. Overall, any of these changes can result in a stressful and anxiety-inducing experience. Due to this realization, if companies considered the layout of the job application, they could once again alleviate barriers facing this community. I finally wanted to include and share statistics surrounding the benefits of inclusive hiring and that there is in fact a business case for hiring employers who are autistic. Benefits of hiring candidates who are autistic not only improve the company workplace, but similarly reflect a unique message to customers and the environment. Highlighting that you are an inclusive employer can help your brand appeal to ethical shoppers and people whose lives are touched by disabilities. In fact, market research shows that 92% of consumers prefer to support companies that hire people with disabilities. Research shows that diverse and inclusive workplaces are 2 times more likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 6 times more likely to be innovative, and 6 times more likely to effectively anticipate change. Being an accessible employer can improve business outcomes, make your team more effective, and help you tap into a significant underserved market. The troubling reality of ASD and unemployment is a global struggle, and it's not limited to one country or one space. Rather, it's impacting communities across Canada as well as within our province. Specifically, as a province, it is important that we educate ourselves on barriers within the application process and ask ourselves what we can do to support a diverse workplace, this being as employers, employees, and coworkers. Although we have changes that are to be made, we thankfully can follow in the footsteps of companies that have made unique programs to tackle this issue. I encourage you to take the time to read into ASD and unemployment, as well as start conversations within your space. Thank you once again for taking the time to join this conversation today, and thank you to the CEI for providing myself and other student researchers this platform to share our research. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Mia, for your amazing presentation. We're now going to move into a Q&A session for Mia. So the first question for you, Mia, is the 85% unemployment rate you mentioned near the beginning of your presentation a Nova Scotia stat or a Canadian number?
Thank you, Rick, for that question. So that was a statistic that I pulled out of the literature that was a Canadian-based, that were Canadian-based authors.
All right. So while we're kind of waiting for some more questions to come in, I was just wondering, Mia, if you could talk a bit about any literature you came across that talked about how asking a future or a job applicant to declare their need for accommodation, whether that would impact their job or their ability to apply for jobs.
So I hadn't found any literature that directly mentioned the relationship between disclosing your disability as well as expecting a request. However, I did find that commonly a lot of individuals do feel hesitant to declare any accommodations that they require, just based off of stereotypes and maybe past experiences in previous employment opportunities. And so that's why it really comes down to the significance within a job posting and a job application. If companies declare immediately at the beginning of their posting that they are accepting and accommodating, it can definitely help alleviate, I think, the stress that individuals experience.
Okay, thank you for your response, Mia. So the next question is curious about person first language, but the choice to use autistic person over person with autism. Is there a reason for this?
Thank you for that question, Jocelyn. So I actually, spent a lot of time looking into the literature here because it was a priority of mine that I was holding myself accountable to appropriate language. And from the literature and stories that I heard, commonly with a person first language approach, it's as if you're titling an individual as their disability, as opposed to when you do language for identity first, but it can be a very tricky, I think, language to navigate. I myself have to hold myself accountable, and I sometimes stumble over my words just because I personally at times was using the incorrect language myself, so I have to correct myself. But the reasoning as to how I found in the literature was just because people wanted to share that they were more than what their title was, and they had an identity first.
So the next question is, do you hope to continue your rubric development for other steps of job seeking, interview, onboarding, retention?
Thank you, Marion, for this question. So my future steps do include now applying this to, well, first of all, getting feedback from community stakeholders as well as career experts to help refine. And hopefully in the future, it would be very interesting if I were able to look at it from different steps or stages in the employment sector. But currently my steps moving forward by the end of the summer and going into this coming school year will be to refine my rubric and then hope to actually apply it within, I think, the long-term goal of being able to develop further rubrics.
Right. So how important do you think it is to be able to make the business case when proposing these types of initiatives to organizations?
I think, unfortunately, it is quite important to present this immediately to employers and companies, just because at the end of the day, I think companies have a few intentions in mind, which is success. And if you're able to present with them the real statistics that show that incorporating diversity and inclusivity into your team is beyond beneficial to not only the success of your company, but the productivity within your space, as well as your customer retention, I think it's highly important to share this, as well as make it known to companies, both large, mid-size, and small, that there are so many benefits accompanied with hiring diverse individuals who are more than qualified for the position.
Okay, so the next question is, I wonder if you came across any supports or organizations that might be able to support employers to be able to create more accessible applications as interview processes.
That is an amazing question, and absolutely. So specifically, a company or an organization that I spent a lot of time researching with was Ready, Willing, and Able, and they have a branch based in Nova Scotia as well. And they are really unique in the sense that not only do they offer tips and tricks, and they'll also support employers in the process, but they also have courses and a lot of amazing resources and toolkits that are online and accessible that I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at, because they're very well done, and they are very, very beneficial to this challenge that we're kind of seeing right now in our province.
And the last question is, what do you see as the next steps in your research, Mia?
I think the next steps in my research will be to continuously refine and touch up this rubric. And then, as I mentioned from Marianne's question, will be to hopefully be able to apply this to companies, as well as further develop different rubrics for different stages, this being interview and retention and onboarding.
All right. Thank you, Mia, for your great answers, and thank you everyone for providing some really great questions and comments. So we're now going to move into our final presenter of the day, which is Aaliyah Fraser, who will be presenting her work titled When You Can't Say the Blaze is Home, Ethnographic Research on Black Essential Workers During COVID-19. Aaliyah is a third-year health science student at St. FX University. She is a member of the women's basketball team, founder of the St. FX BIPOC Varsity Association, member of the St. FX Leadership Academy, and St. FX SAAC Diversity and Equity Representative. The floor is yours, Aaliyah.
Perfect. One sec. Let me just share my screen. There we go. All right. So you kind of just introduced me. Thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate that. But I'm going to restate some things Hannah said. So my name is Aaliyah Fraser, and my research is titled When You Can't Say the Blaze is Home, and it's ethnographic research on Black essential workers and Black business owners during COVID-19. So I go by she, her. I'm a student athlete and a member of the women's basketball team, and I'm going into my third year studying health sciences at St. FX. I'm the founder of the St. FX BIPOC Varsity Association, which is just an association that kind of helps Black and Indigenous and other minority athletes. And I also did surveys for that association this previous school year. I'm a membership of Leadership Academy at St. FX, and I'm also a member of the St. FX Student Athlete Advisory Council. So with COVID, there's been a lot of terms that kind of came out of nowhere and have kind of been reinvented because of the pandemic. So the term essential worker is one of those terms. So going into this research, we weren't really sure which angle we were going to go with essential worker, because it's very much a term that people kind of can coin for themselves. To one person, what might be an essential worker is not to others. So an example of that might be someone being a grocery store worker and considering themselves an essential worker, and then someone else being a teacher and considering themselves an essential worker. But the term is very fluid, and we just kind of wanted to play around with that with our interviews and have a very diverse demographic of essential workers. So our definition is not concrete, and it could again change as we dive deeper into the pandemic. So why Black essential workers and Black business owners? So pre-research, when we were kind of starting to get everything together and find literature, we noticed that a lot of the research already existing and a lot of the articles that were out there weren't focused on race. And we also noticed that a lot of the American articles did include race-based data, but not the Canadian articles. So we decided to go on the angle of Black essential workers and business owners in COVID to kind of combat that gap in literature. So the research goals are basically to understand what it's like, not only to be an essential worker during a pandemic, but to be a Black essential worker during a pandemic, which is really important because often minority populations experience things differently than majority populations, as Black essential workers and business owners are more susceptible to catching COVID-19 and other minorities as well. So the timeline. So we started in May, and that's when we started looking for articles, and we ended up seeking assistance from a lot of different people in the community. So we went to the Black Business Association of Nova Scotia, and then they really helped us out with getting those contacts, because our research is very niche. Like, it's not something that everyone can participate in. So we went from there and had a huge email list of probably like 300 people and sent out a mass email. And from there, we just kind of started rolling. So we began interviewing in June, the 1st of June, and each interview is between 20 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on how much detail the person provides and just basically how much they like to talk, is how I like to put it. And yeah, we started interviewing, and we've just kind of been going ever since. So the questions we developed in May, and basically they were to understand what it's like in your job, in your workplace, before and after COVID. So our pre-COVID questions are based before the March 13th, 2020 date, because at least in Nova Scotia, that's when everything became shut down and when we started going on lockdown. So the first set of questions, I just have an example here of the first 5 questions. So the first question is, do you work in an essential service? And then you don't ask for the name of the company, but you can just record it. And again, we have the term essential highlighted because it is different for everyone. Then we wanted to know how long they worked in their job, if they worked full-time or part-time, how many hours a week did they work, and why, or what they did in their job pre-COVID. So the pre-COVID questions are really important in collecting our data, because we also asked post-COVID questions. So it's really interesting when you finish the interview and you're kind of going through to see everything they said, to compare the pre-COVID and the post-COVID. And to me personally, I found it interesting because there is certain people who we interviewed who were changing careers throughout the pandemic. So the pre-COVID questions are completely different than the post-COVID questions. There was an example of a woman I interviewed, and pre-COVID, she was working in construction with her husband, but when the pandemic began, their jobs shut down, and they're at home and they're kind of struggling. They're like, okay, how can we kind of get out of this rut? So they decided to open their own business, and they ended up opening a sewing shop, which is like completely different than construction. So just things like that are really interesting to see from the pre and post-COVID. So in the post-COVID questions, again, basically same as the pre-COVID, and yeah. So transcripts. So all the interviews are recorded using Microsoft Teams, and then we use this thing that transcribes the interview. So it basically takes everything that the person is saying during the interview and it puts it into text. And sometimes, depending if the person has an accent or if they use slang or the quality of the audio, it gets a little bit messed up, which is kind of challenging. So that's when we just go through and make sure everything makes sense, everything sounds right, and we're conveying what they wanted to say. So this is an example of a transcript. Typically they can be between like 15 to 30, 40 pages long. So I just took an excerpt from one of the interviews, and this is basically how it goes. So speaker 1 is myself. So I asked them what their pre-COVID roles and tasks are before March 13th, 2020. And I asked, do you work in an essential service? And they say yes. Then I ask what service it would be. And this person just happens to be a school teacher. So then we continue, how many years are you teaching? And we kind of dive in to who they are and what they do. And the whole point of this is just kind of to dig deeper from the yes and no answers and really understand this person's career and what they've gone through with the pandemic. So this is what it looks like when we code. So basically what coding is our first category has interview excerpt. And the interview excerpt is we take a direct quote from what the person says, and then it goes to the excerpt summary where we break it down in the property, then we break it down a little bit more, then descriptors just kind of explain what the person said. So if you look At the first category, it says, I'm a school teacher. Then it gets broken down to school teacher, then just teacher during COVID. So in the little parentheses, we have during COVID and pre-COVID, as you can see. And it's interesting to compare the during COVID to the pre-COVID as you go through, because it shows how things have changed for better, for worse, and you can kind of compare and contrast those differences, and it makes it pretty interesting. So we code all the interviews, and again, these are like pages and pages and pages long, and it basically is just breaking down everything the person said to gain a deeper understanding and take out what we think is the most important part of the interview and make it easier for you guys to understand. Okay, so common themes that we have found in our interviews are work and physical and process changes. So these are all just quotes that I've taken from recent interviews and just kind of combined them into the category of work, physical, and process changes, because they all kind of had those underlying themes. So the first quote is, correctional facilities shut down access to public. Schools closed down due to lockdowns, stayed home with kids because childcare would have been impossible. Working remote, not going into the office at all. School scheduled to be online. Setting up our office space at home and not sharing office spaces. So one of the common themes between all of these quotes from our interviews is that the people were all shut down, couldn't go to work, working from home. So we try to like categorize the interviews like that and make little groups between the people so we can see similarities and we can see differences as well. So the next category of similarities that we found was mental health, stress, burnout, and counseling. So these are, again, more quotes from our interviews. My mental health has definitely decreased. Being mindful of my own well-being and mental health. Constantly under stress level extremely high. No answers to when things would be open again. During lockdown, it's extremely stressful and you don't know if you're making the right choice. Safety is a priority, so it can be stressful to be essential. You could have counseling if you needed, and people are stressed and stuff like that. We have places that you could go to if you feel that you need extra help. They, friends and family, understand the burnout. I was pretty stressed. High stress levels, definitely a thing during COVID. At the beginning, it was very nerve-wracking. So again, you can see these are probably pulled from, I'd say 9, 10 different interviews. And all these people are generally saying the same thing in a different way, that the pandemic has definitely decreased their mental health, increased stress, caused burnout, counseling. And that's really important to see, because if there's a majority of people out of, let's say, I don't know, the 20 people we interviewed that are all having these common issues, that's important to note. And it's really interesting to see. The next category of common themes we have is relationships and connections. So COVID created an opportunity to strengthen relationships while working. So we've strengthened relationships with places like Value Village. Me and my employer get along very well. We actually have gotten tighter with my coworkers, knowing each other on a deeper level. So again, you can see the common theme of interconnectedness in the office, becoming closer with coworkers and bosses and all that kind of thing during COVID. So work, physical, and process change. So this category is similar to the previous one, but this one kind of just describes physical changes within an office to protect the employers or to protect the employees during COVID. So again, just more excerpts from interviews. So this person said there was arrows on the floor, signs around the office, plexiglass protective physical signs throughout the office. I was the first person with a mask moving toward masks. We still sell a lot of regular black masks. Masks weren't available. Ppe Training, which is protective wear. We have 6 feet markers when we walk into the building. Was given 2,000 masks to distribute in the community, 6 meters of each other's, put your masks up. Make sure we're wearing our PPE properly, mask, shield, gown, gloves, and everything wearing masks. So this category was really interesting because we had a huge variety of people. So we had people working in offices, people working in small business, people working in hospitals, people who were teachers. So it's interesting that they all have common themes of masks and all that stuff and shortage of masks. So while I was going through the interviews recently, kind of comparing and contrasting, there's a lot of people who brought up shortage of masks, which is something that I personally wouldn't have thought of when talking about masks, because at least I was blessed enough to have masks always readily available, but to all of these people that I interviewed, a lot of them did not have access to masks, which is interesting if we compare our study on Black essential workers to another study, because lack of access to masks might not be an issue for someone of higher socioeconomic status or something like that. All right, so this category is very interesting because it's specific to our study on Black essential workers. And one of the main themes we found when we started asking more questions based on race and what it's like to be a Black person in the workforce, that's when we started getting deeper answers and when we started to see like an immense amount of common themes. So these are some more quotes again from some notes. So the only Black person within my office, only Black person on my team. So that's been like really challenging. Being African Nova Scotian and gaining employment gaining employment isn't safe or easy task. Only person of color with a permanent part-time position. Need faculty who are racialized and also at the leadership level. Being a person of color in the workplace, you often work with coworkers that are not used to working with people of color. Underrepresented by employer. I face superiors at work who don't understand what it's like to be a Black person in a corporation. Show some representation. So all of these quotes from people that we interviewed are really interesting because it talks about their struggles and being alone. And it's also very interesting too, when we break it down again and we see the difference between male and female essential workers in corporations, I believe. No, maybe it's not in here. Anyway, so there's a slide that is, I guess, missing. But on this slide, it's basically a table and it's comparing some of these quotes and who said what. So we have a category that has the sex, and a lot of women noticed that people were more direct and open with their racism in the workplace. So they would say things about their hair, about their skin. People were more outwardly racist to women than they were with men, which is also a very interesting part of our study. So that is actually all my presentation for today. Thank you so much to the Center for Employment Innovation for allowing me to have this platform. And thank you so much to my supervisor, Dr. Ellen Crumley, for being the best and for supporting me all summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaliyah, for your great presentation. We will now move into a Q&A session for Aaliyah. While we wait for some questions to come through, I was wondering if you had any insights into how the continuous cycle of lockdown and reopening and lockdown again has impacted Black essential workers and business owners.
Wait, sorry, can you repeat the questions?
Yeah, for sure, Aaliyah. I was just wondering, while we wait for some questions to come in, if you had any kind of information from your surveys and your interviews about how the constant lockdown and reopening has impacted Black essential workers and business owners.
So one thing I would say that definitely impacted them is, I would say, the mental health side of things. They definitely experienced a lot of mental health issues being on lockdown because a lot of the people that I spoke with were business owners, so their business had to shut down. But it's interesting to see how people were combating that. So there's a woman that I spoke to, as I mentioned before, who was working in construction, but then ended up opening a store with her partner. So what she did is, because her store got shut down, you know, they just opened a new business. They have 2 small kids, so they're kind of struggling to make ends meet as the pandemic progresses. So what they did is they became a Canada Post approved facility. So they technically were, in the eyes of the government, like an essential service. So they were allowed to stay open. So just seeing people be creative with things with that. A lot of people said they would do things on the side to kind of make money. There was a woman who I interviewed who was a teacher, and she started tutoring, which she'd never done before. But just little things like that during the pandemic, that people use their creativity to kind of help with the negatives. And yeah.
Right, so another question is, thank you so much for your presentation, Aaliyah. What do you believe are important next steps given your research findings and how COVID-19 has impacted Black essential workers?
I would say next steps that would be really important is just kind of getting our information out there as quickly as possible, because things are constantly, you know, changing with the pandemic, and having that literature on Black essential workers and Black business owners for people to really see what they go through and what it's like is super, super important for us, because right now there's very, very minimal articles and very minimal literature. So I guess just educating the general population on what it's like and publishing our research. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And the next question is, could you discuss more about how people perceived essential work? Did they discuss tensions with some types of essential work that are not sufficiently compensated, but are/were at a great risk of exposure to COVID-19?
Yes, so common themes when talking to nurses were just being understaffed in healthcare. Like there's been lack of healthcare workers, especially with the pandemic. Actually, one of the women I talked to was in a seniors home that had a pretty big COVID outbreak, and she was just saying how nothing changed with her compensation. She was required to isolate for 2 weeks, couldn't work, was very nervous to be around her kids, kind of thing. So just things like that. Where a lot of people who were considered essential workers felt they weren't compensated. Healthcare workers, aside from other people that I interviewed, did receive minimal compensation, but for the work they were doing, it was not much. That was definitely a common theme with a lot of people, was their compensation. And even just exposures. Like a lot of people I talked to had health issues, so they felt they wish they were given the option to kind of work at home if they're an essential worker, but then they're not being financially compensated, so they're kind of forced to work even if they don't feel comfortable with the pandemic. But yeah, just to go back to the first sentence, discuss more about how people perceived essential work. So that's an interesting question, because I had some people who, worked in grocery stores and, pharmacies. So like, again, that government coined term, essential workers, but then they didn't consider themselves essential workers. And I have, I'm trying to think of someone who considered them an essential worker, which to others might not. I think there's a lady who did sewing who considered herself an essential worker, which to others it may not seem. So it's just kind of a fluid term that the definition of essential kind of depends on the person. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So I'll now open up the floor for any kind of additional questions that people have for any of the other panelists that they didn't have or didn't get answered during the Q&A session for that specific presentation. Okay, if there are no additional questions, I just want to thank you all again for taking the time to come and listen to the presentations today and engage with the presenters and the panelists with your questions and your comments. Sorry. The last question, I just saw it come up, is for all the panelists, what advice might you have for other young people who might be interested in research?
I would say
oh, sorry, Elia, you go ahead.
You can go first, don't worry.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say, if you're interested in research, at whatever level you're at, if finding someone who will support the ideas you have is such a huge component, at least for me, having someone to back up my ideas, someone to bounce ideas off of, but really just having a passion in a topic and going for it and putting yourself out there is really the biggest advice I can give.
I am going to completely echo what Megan shared. I think it starts with kind of having a seed planted in your own head with this being something that you're potentially really passionate about and just want to educate yourself on and maybe those around you. And then also getting that support from an older figure or an organization that can really support you. And like Megan said, that you can bounce ideas off of is similarly, a really great way to start. And it can be daunting at times, kind of overwhelming, but I think it has so many benefits associated with it. So I just say kind of go in full force and go in with an open mind too. Take everything that you have and just roll with it, I guess.
All right. Did you want to add anything, Aaliyah, to the question?
Yeah, I would say just don't be afraid to make mistakes, and just feel free to ask for help. And if you're really passionate about something, just go for it, because you'll just learn more about the topic and you won't lose anything.
All right. Well, thank you all for answering that question. I think it's some really good insights to young people who are also interested in completing research. And yeah, so like I said, thank you to everyone for joining the day 3 panel presentations. I invite you to all attend tomorrow's research symposium, which will be focused on the theme of supporting youth in the workplace. And Brenda has attached the link to where you can register if you've not already done so. Yeah, so thank you again for coming, and thank you to the panelists for presenting their wonderful work over this summer.